Today we're going to talk about angle theorems. Our first angle theorem is the vertical angles theorem. Remember, vertical angles are opposite angles, and the vertical angles theorem says that all vertical angles are congruent. This was something we've already talked about, but now we have a theorem that we can actually use in a proof. The second theorem we're going to talk about is the right angle theorem, which says all right angles are congruent. Again, that should make sense if one angle is 90 degrees and another angle is 90 degrees, that they're exactly the same, but now we have a theorem that will help us skip a few steps in a proof. The third theorem, again, is something that we should be familiar with. It's called the triangle angle sum theorem. This says that the sum of the angles of a triangle is always 180 degrees. Again, something we've worked with in the past, but just a theorem to allow us to put it into a proof when we use deductive reasoning. So using what we know, let's find the values of the variables. If we look at this first set, 2x plus 1 and 4x, well, those are vertical angles, and we know vertical angles are congruent. So if we set those two expressions equal to each other and solve, we get x is 1/2. If we look at our second example, again we have a set of vertical angles, and our vertical angle theorem says vertical angles are congruent. So let's set the two expressions equal and solve for x. X is 40. And if we wanted to find the value of those angles, we could plug them back in or substitute and see if the angles are congruent. That way we could check our math. One more thing we want to look at, we've talked about deductive reasoning, but let's look at a proof using deductive reasoning. So remember, when we start a proof, you are given a statement that you know is true, and you're trying to get to a final statement or proof. So the statement we're given is angle 1 is congruent to angle 4. And so that's going to be our first set in our proof. And the reason that is it's given. Then angle 1 is congruent to angle 3, and angle 2 is congruent to angle 4. Now if we look at these two angles here, 2 and 4, and 1 and 3, they're opposite angles. Opposite angles are vertical angles. And because we know they're vertical angles, we know they're congruent by the vertical angles theorem. Then we know 1 is congruent to 2. Well, why would that be? Well, I know 1 is congruent to 4, and 4 is congruent to 2, therefore 1 is congruent to 2. That is the transitive property. And finally, I know 2 is congruent to 3, which is our final statement we want to prove. And I can say this because, again, I know 1 is congruent to 3, and 2 is congruent to 1, therefore 2 is congruent to 3. Again, using the transitive property. And that's it for today. Nice and short. Make sure you remember those theorems, and we're going to practice more in class. Have a wonderful night.